Welcome back, everyone, to another 30 to 40 minutes of misery and abject desperation. I'm Sriram. I am, I guess you could call me the erstwhile host of the MMA podcast. I used to do it a lot more regularly, but both me and Ed have run into, more things to do. And MMA hasn't been insanely interesting to do full, insane card breakdowns on. There have been like one or two cool fights a card, maybe. Maybe I should have shown up to do something on Dos Anjos versus Moycano, but the main event on that was Covington versus Masvidal, for instance. So nothing that really demanded our attention to come away from our very busy lives. I have been in graduate accounting courses, so I assure you that in my absence, I have not been having any fun. But yeah, I felt bad about not doing anything for the last few months, I suppose, aside from that interview with New England Cartel striking coach Jake Manini, which you should check out. See, right back to the grind. I'm so good at this. I'm just a natural. But aside from that, I haven't been doing a whole lot, and I felt it would be kind of imprudent to look at a card like UFC 273 and go outside of the top 5 fights. This isn't anything special. So obviously I shouldn't do anything on it. So I'm here to talk about, a couple of decent, fun fights that are on this next card. A couple of them involving pound for pound top talents, a couple of top contenders, a couple of interesting guys who aren't necessarily prospects at this point, but who have some interesting things that can be said about them. So if you still listen to the podcast, thank you. I believe Christian and Silas are the flagship show now. I'm more of a side show, but I'm better that way. So let's start with the main event, Alexander Volkanovski versus Korean Zombie. I think a lot of people know my position on the Korean Zombie just because he's kind of the best example of why featherweight matchmaking is bizarre and why featherweight rankings are bizarre. And I think he's the best example because he's not a bad fighter. I mean, he has a lot of decent wins. He has a lot of decent performances. But if you look at where he stands in the rankings, it's kind of nonsense. And if you look at the way that he got this title fight, it's even more nonsense. Korean Zombie lost a wide decision to one Brian Ortega back in October of 2020, I believe. That wasn't a great fight from him, but he apparently basically got knocked out in the second round and kept fighting for 3 more, which is something that he also has in common with Ortega in that title fight. But there's no reason that you can take a ton out of that. I think a lot of people think, but nevertheless, it was a wide loss to someone who wasn't in that, sort of elite of the elite stratum of 145 and Alexander Volkanovski and Max Holloway. So Zombie lost that 50-45, no question. And then he came back and fought Dan Ige. And now Ige is he's a solid win. He's a top 10-ish sort of fighter. Really keeps getting really good bookings like Emmett and Cater and Barboza and Korean Zombie because A, he's fine, and B, he's basically Ali Abdelaziz's son. So KZ winning that fight, impressive. Ige is a good fighter. I believe I picked Ige there actually, so I'll eat some crow on that. Not a ton, as I'll go into in a bit. Played a little bit, but he looked fine in that fight. But Dan Ige is also not a title eliminator sort of fight. The circumstances have come together with Max Holloway pulling out of the Volkanovski three-peat, then being fine and volunteering to be his own replacement, that really there's no point to this fight, both in terms of a matchmaking perspective and a real intrigue perspective. But if there's some intrigue to really, Volkanovski being the number 1 pound for pound fighter, it's that he's not really as durable as the last champion. I mean, he's really not as, one shot, I'll eat it and come back and kill you durable as a bunch of the top 5, really. I mean, if you look at the top 5 of featherweight, Yair Rodriguez is hard to say. He has chin, but he hasn't been hit by hitters as big. KZ, he's stupid durable, but, I guess you can sort of count both of those guys out because they have been hurt. But Calvin Kattar, Max Holloway, Brian Ortega, 3 of the most durable guys I've ever seen in MMA, period. And Volkanovski, it's a real credit to him that he's the undisputed champion, the undisputed number 1 at a division with so many beasts while not necessarily being as big of a durability beast. So if there's some intrigue to the Korean Zombie fight, is that Korean Zombie is a fast, sharp starter who has a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of tools. He has a lot of comfort in terms of punishing early, safe leads. Early, when guys want to read him, they tend to run into a little bit of trouble. When guys try to rush him, they also run into a little bit of trouble. So Zombie's best wins. I'd say, Frankie Edgar, he was kind of old at the time. He's still fine, but, he went on to beat Pedro Munoz, but that wasn't like a super notable win at featherweight at the time. But Renato Moycano, Mark Hominick, I guess a lot of people would say Yair Rodriguez after that last second. That fight actually got me off the Zombie train for good in terms of, is he a, real competitive elite fighter? It got me off the train for both of them because that fight was disgusting. And I'll go into why in a bit. But Zombie has a bunch of good wins. But it seems like a lot of people seem to understand that his route is a knockout in the first round. And I fully agree. Like, this is one place where I'm not going to be a contrarian. I know that's going to surprise you. But yeah, Zombie's route is a KO1. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, both in terms of Zombie's skill set, in terms of Volk's skill set. The biggest thing in terms of Zombie's skill set is what I just mentioned. His thing in a lot of situations is round one shock and all. When Renato Moycano came out trying to jab, which is one thing that Moycano does a lot, Zombie just smacked him for like the second jab with a cross counter, and it was a good cross counter. He sort of leaned over his lead hip to make him look closer than he was, and then turned into the cross counter when Moycano bit on it to try to jab him in the head. But it's tough to take a whole lot away from that sort of fight, considering that Moycano is kind of the sort of nightmare matchup that I'd like to see KZ deal a lot more with it at length. Durability wise, obviously there's no contest between Renato Moycano and Korean Zombie. But in terms of the tools that Moycano has, it would have been a lot more useful to see Zombie actually contend with them instead of just knocking him out. It feels like a spoiled critique, but it is what it is. We didn't learn anything about Zombie from that fight. You can sort of say the same thing about Mark Hominick. Hominick's defense has always been kind of janky compared to his offense, but there are a lot of ways in which Hominick could make the counterpuncher's job really hard, and instead Zombie just sort of smoked him in about 10 seconds. So it feels like there's a lot of unknowns about Korean Zombie, which has been kind of a constant through his career. But at this point, I think I'm confident saying that he is a very good counterpuncher in terms of punishing early reading attempts. B, he is a crazy puncher. C, and now we sort of get into the bad stuff. C, he is not all that great at covering distance safely. And I think ringcraft is one place where you kind of have to beat Alexander Volkanovski. If your thing is being a neutral space counterpuncher, as it is for Korean Zombie, Volkanovski is very, very difficult I suppose the reasons are obvious. Volkanovski is one of the best in the sport at drawing out counters, really punishing your attempts to time them. Offensive sequencing, he's brilliant at that. Really, he works behind his jab and his inside lead leg, the inside leg kick, as well as anyone in MMA, as well as anyone I've seen. He's a brilliant jabber. He's brilliant at using it to draw out counters, sort of defending proactively off with both that dip and that little frame he does. The inside leg kick uses to break guys' balance on the step in for sure, but he also uses it as a setup, punches off it off, and he did that a bunch against Max Holloway, even where like the threat of the inside leg kick, it wasn't even like a real inside leg kick. It was just like this exaggerated sort of silly step in, and then he would immediately punch off it because Holloway's like, well, this is an inside leg kick, and I have to make sure that my balance isn't broken by the fact that I'm getting hit by this. So Volkanovski did a brilliant job building off that. He's a great hand fight. Like, his lead hand is in general one of the most versatile in MMA. Lots of hand fighting, lots of feinting, and really it's his command of rhythm and his command of the ring that make all of this so viable. And Korean Zombie being kind of willing to concede his opponent's rhythm and being willing to concede the ring mean that he's kind of at an uphill battle against Alexander Volkanovski. Now, the one thing that I think people will note with this fight as a specific spot of trouble for Alexander Volkanovski is the uppercut. In the fight with Max Holloway, the rematch, Volkanovski's proactive defense was punished a little bit by Max Holloway consistently countering with these uppercut left hook combos, and countering with the uppercut in terms of when Volkanovski would enter with the jab, Holloway was really, really keen on countering with the uppercut to time that the proactive dip, which meant that Volkanovski couldn't really safely do that a whole lot. It got him dropped in the second round. It got him hit a couple times. I think even the early in the second round too. So a lot of incidents of that. But I think the thing to note about that is that Volkanovski was very quick at taking that away. Volkanovski didn't allow that to be a consistent threat, because Volkanovski started, drawing out the uppercut, pulling his head offline, jabbing and pulling his head back, which isn't like awesome, but he was, consistently aware of the counters that Max was going to bring, jabbing and pivoting. The pivoting jab actually showed up a lot more later in the fight to take away the uppercut counter for Holloway. So eventually when Holloway tried to throw the uppercut, it just got him hurt. Well, not hurt, it's Max Holloway, but it got him hit very hard. So it's really a good example of why trying to win in moments against Alexander Volkanovski, it's doable. Brian Ortega nearly did it a couple times, but it's very difficult. And he makes it more difficult as the fight goes on, with the way that his game layers, with the way that everything looks like something else. Really, I think it's something that our friend Dan Albert pointed out in his breakdown of Volkanovski's fight against Max Holloway. Might have been the first one, might have been the second one of them. But he does this in every fight, so it's irrelevant. But Volkanovski's ability to not just use like discrete feints, but even use his posture as a threat. So one thing that he does a lot is sort of leans over his lead hip. So it often turns into this sort of springing power jab a whole lot. Sometimes it turns into a throwaway right hand. Sometimes he's able to whip it over into that lead leg kick. So that posture in itself it's sort of a feint, and it still keeps him in position to defend any sort of things that come at him. So, obviously not optimal, heavy over his lead hip sometimes, but it's not a commitment is the point. And if it draws something out, by and large, it's something that Volkanovski is aware of after that one time. So if he does it again, he's going to be ready for it. But that's one part. Is I don't think Korean Zombie is all that equipped to deal with Volkanovski on the counter. The other thing, I'm pretty sure Korean Zombie is not very good at dealing with kicks. We saw Brian Ortega get a whole lot for free. We've seen guys, Yair Rodriguez got, basically the Rodriguez fight was in between the pocket exchanges, which also weren't super encouraging for Korean Zombie in a fight like this. In between those, it was just Korean Zombie sort of standing at range, getting kicked. Zombie's pressure it's not great. He doesn't really know how to close distance all that well. And when he has guys against the fence, he still kind of relied, especially against Ortega, he kind of relied on Ortega being flustered into showing something and then being able to counter with him against the fence instead of like being able to lead safely. Like, we're going to talk about in the co-main event, what sort of things that really good pressure fighters do in this sort of situations. And Korean Zombie doesn't really have any of that. So with that, Volkanovski seems very well poised to move around the outside, kick for free, set up off his kicks, enter. And I don't really know if Korean Zombie is really the type to cut off his movement. If you look at the things that have given Volkanovski trouble in the past, it's pocket exchanges, where it's really hard to enforce pocket exchanges on him, but when he's in there, it's not super hard to hit him. He, against Aldo and Mendez sort of defaulted to a static high guard. And that got him hurt to the body got him hit to the body a couple times. But otherwise, it's hard to find. The uppercut counter is one, but again, it's not it's kind of an extension of the thing I just mentioned. And also B, it's really, really hard to take advantage of a singular specific counter against Volkanovski more than once or twice. Like Max Holloway is one of the fellow offensively smartest fighters in the sport. And he couldn't get away with it for very long, like rounds 3 and 5 were sort of washouts for Volkanovski. Round 4, I think I still gave to Volkanovski. So it's really hard to key in on a couple specific things and still beat him. The other thing that kind of has given Volkanovski trouble, and this was the real coup for Max Holloway, was sort of feinting in behind the kicks instead of the jab. Volkanovski's kick defense isn't like incredible. Ryan Wagner has pointed out that a bunch of CKB guys don't really like getting kicked through the open side. Adesanya is kind of an exception, but they sort of just let themselves get kicked through the open side. Dan Hooker's a good example. Volkanovski's one loss against, I believe Corey Nelson had that, where he just sort of spammed the open stance kick, the rear kick to the body over and over, and it didn't really let Volkanovski do a whole lot. Obviously, he's improved a ton since then, but it's very probably still a problem. So with all that, I don't think Korean Zombie is the guy to take advantage of that. Like, it's possible, but he is at honestly a camp that has done some good work over the last couple months. Zombie's aligned himself with Henry Cejudo. I don't know how long he's been there. If this was his first time, I'd kind of be a little bit more encouraged because the Ige performance was not great in terms of the sort of it was good in terms of Zombie turning to the wrestling after the striking started to get out of hand a little bit. But Ige figured out that backstepping left hook and then just sort of took control of the striking very quickly after that. So, the thing stopping him really was the range, and Volkanovski's a lot better at covering distance than Dan Ige. Lots of little shifting combinations, punching into kicks, kicking into punches. Retreating linearly against Volkanovski is not a safe thing to do. And retreating linearly with like predictable counters, it's something that Volkanovski is going to reliably deal with. So if the Cejudo camp has something really specific and sharp for Zombie to take advantage of, I think it really still does limit his chances to a first round stoppage. A third thing, so if Korean Zombie does decide to just go after Volk, Zombie understands he's not a stupid fighter, really. Zombie understands that his win condition is probably early, is probably an early knockout. Maybe his route is to rush Volk, try as hard as he can to pressure, instead of waiting on the counter for maybe the hardest guy to counter in the division right now. I think the difficulty with that is that we've seen the Yair Rodriguez fight, when guys really try to draw Zombie out and don't give him counters in the pocket, Zombie isn't great at covering that distance. Against Yair Rodriguez, it was a lot of like shifting combinations, running into stuff. I think Yair Rodriguez had success counter jabbing Zombie early in that fight, which is not something that Yair Rodriguez should ever do to anybody. And of course, there's the finish, which I know a lot of people consider that to be just a total anomaly, and it really is. But like the way Zombie was positioned in pretty much the entirety of that fight, the details of the counter are kind of irrelevant. Yair Rodriguez is not a counterpuncher, so it's obvious that he had to go to something jank and stupid like that up elbow to get to it. But the way that Zombie was fighting that entire fight, I think someone who is really capable on the counter would have punished that a lot earlier. And Volkanovski is very capable on the counter. It's not just, taking away the jab with the leg kicks as we saw in the Holloway fight, but, strong cross counters, strong counter left hooks. Really, again, it's really difficult to charge him straight back to the fence because he's constantly, breaking the line of attack. He's sneaky. He's like kind of shifty in like a really sneaky way. We saw that in the Holloway 2 fight. We like had some success sort of circling out to the open side and walking him into straights. When, as I mentioned earlier, when guys retreat linearly, he's willing to chase them back with shifting combinations. We saw in the first Max fight when Max went southpaw, where he'd start shifting into right hooks. So lots of cool things from Volkanovski in terms of his footwork, and chasing him back. It's just not something that you can really do, even if you are stupid durable, because if you could, Max Holloway would have done it, but he got stopped at the first step over and over and over. The other thing that really helps Volk is that he has really sharp, consistent clinch entries, which is something, again, that we have in common between the likely winners of the main and co-main event, is that they have a really established set transitional game. When Max Holloway started coming on stronger later in the fight, in the first fight, Volkanovski just turned it into a clinch and clobbered him from an elbow in the 5th round. And, even in the second fight, right, we saw him punching into underhooks and going for like inside trips, lots of neat transitional things that are likely to limit the way that Korean Zombie can really rush Volk back and get anything done. Of course, the biggest thing is the right hand counters, the left hooks. We've seen that a whole bunch from Volkanovski. So with all that, it's the odds on Volkanovski are like minus 800. I'm not sure I see a ton of value on Korean Zombie even so. It's a sort of fight where I think you kind of have to have Zombie round 1 finish for anything to, like, the line for Zombie money line and Zombie round 1 finish would probably be identical. Zombie's a dangerous counterpuncher, but in a lot of ways, I think he's a really limited counterpuncher in that he has a strong early idea of what he needs to counter stuff with, but after a point, when guys start building on it, it's really, really difficult for him. I think that's the biggest takeaway from the Ortega fight, which, like, even before the spinning elbow knockout, Ortega, he went southpaw to not give Zombie the easy left hook cross counters. And at that point, Ortega could kind of just do whatever he wanted after a certain point, You could, feint in, kick, jab, straight punch. And Zombie was just sort of scrambled. And I get why he was scrambled after that second round, but even through the second round, right? Like he didn't have much of an idea on how to counter those things, despite his thing being as a counterpuncher. And Ortega is not necessarily the hardest guy to counter in the world. He's not like a great proactive defense sort of guy. His ring craft in that fight, it looked fine, but it didn't look much better than fine. We saw him get backed up to the fence a couple times, and Zombie just didn't really have the ability to really take advantage because, again, he's not as good leading as he is countering, and he's not as good at countering as a whole bunch of guys. I think one thing that I've said in the past is the Korean Zombie kind of reminds me of like his primary skill set is kind of like Calvin Kattar's B game, where like, you got this like neutral space counterpunching to catch guys coming in. It's just that he doesn't have the ability to draw guys onto his counters the way that someone like Calvin Kattar can with the jab and with the feints. And he doesn't really have the sort of defense that Calvin Kattar does to set up those counters. It's not like disgustingly bad, but I wouldn't say that it's anything special. And I think against Volkanovski defense isn't anything special either, but he absolutely nails down where he is in the ring and where his opponent is in the ring. And that's the sort of thing that I think you need to solve with Volk to beat him consistently. Yeah, that's pretty much my read on the fight. I don't think Volkanovski should have much trouble here. And honestly, I think it's kind of a shame just because there aren't a ton of elites left for Volkanovski to beat. He's already beaten Max twice. I think Kattar's the best guy outside of Max and Volk in the division, but he's also kind of a trivially easy style matchup for Volkanovski. He's already beaten Brian Ortega, it was a solid win. After that, I guess you've got guys like Josh Emmett and Arnold Allen coming up, who would be decent wins, but nothing super established yet, which leaves, nobody really. And like, I don't think Korean Zombie deserves the title shot as much as either Emmett or Allen. He arguably doesn't deserve it as much as Calvin Kattar, despite Kattar losing to Max Holloway so badly like a year and 3 months ago. So it's an interesting situation, and I think it should be a showcase fight for Alexander Volkanovski, but there's some intrigue there in terms of, can Volkanovski navigate the danger yet again against someone who is at least nominally capable of, punishing jabbery. I think Volkanovski probably just doesn't jab early. I think it's a very likely possibility where he just comes out, builds off the leg kick, or leg kicks him super hard when he's not really poised to defend it, starts building off that, and only starts jabbing when Korean Zombie is already like the fight's out of his control and he's too scrambled to do anything. The wrestling, I'm not sure Volk is really going to push that. Korean Zombie is secretly a very good wrestler and grappler. So I think it probably ends up a striking fight and Volkanovski probably dominates. But, it's a fight worth watching. Really, like, no featherweight is straight up bad in the rankings. All of them have some sort of danger to offer. Even a great champion like Volkanovski, he's not the youngest guy in the world. He's been fighting for a while, and he's not, he's been fighting for a while, and he's not all that young. Max Holloway probably has youth on him, like a whole lot of youth on him. So who really knows? I mean, his fights haven't been ugly, but he got dropped in Mendez, he got dropped in Holloway twice, and he got dropped in Ortega off that leg kick. So he's not invulnerable, but I think he's the best fighter in the world, and I think he probably proves why. Now, the co-main event has the other guy who you could very plausibly consider the best fighter in the world, and that's Petr Yan. Yan's rematching Aljamain Sterling, and I think this fight, it's really interesting, but there's also way less to say because we've already seen this fight. We saw it last time at UFC 259. It was the Blachowicz Adesanya card, so I believe it's 259. But yeah, basically what we saw in that fight was, I think, a really, really, really strong performance from Aljamain Sterling, which is what makes me so pessimistic about his chances here. Aljamain Sterling, he had the right idea on what to do with Petr Yan early, and he had to pretty much cram 5 rounds of effort, 5 rounds of very inefficient effort, into keeping Yan on the defensive early in the fight. And really all that did was it let Yan keep reading him. It let Yan keep letting him waste energy on Yan's defensive shell, on his cross check, on really, Aljo struggled very, very hard to hit Yan clean. I think he landed like a couple knees, landed a couple kicks, but really the boxing offense didn't go well at all for him. And punching into the punching into the clinch didn't really work out all that well either, for a couple reasons. One, Yan was, from the beginning of the fight, he was able to command the clinch entries very, very easily. Like the point I knew Yan would win that fight was like in the first minute, where Aljamain tried to like linear kick into a clinch entry, and Yan just honed in on his wrist and grabbed it out of the air. Like it was insane how quickly he caught on to Aljo's tactics. And after that, like I didn't really think there was much of a shot. But one, yeah, Yan ruled the entries, but two, Yan also just won in the clinch a whole lot. Lots of trips, lots of lifts from the rear standing. And the problem with the takedown was Jan's, he's very good fundamentally at takedown defense. Like his clinch game links really well into takedown defense in general. We're controlling the wrist and, grip fighting, forcing guys into bad positions. But also in terms of just takedown defense, the way he'd like redirect Aljo was just incredible. He'd always like get his hips out of the way, he'd like pivot like Jose Aldo sometimes. Let Aljo just run past him, and that would just kill the penetration on any of his shots. So after that, he just ended up in the clinch, and Yan would beat him up, punch him out of there. Lots of really nice body work. The leg kick dropped him early, a bunch of clean body shots later in the fight. After Aljo sort of tired, it became kind of academic, and he sort of tired in like round 3. Round 2 was probably Aljo's strongest round, but really it was Aljo kind of conceding that the wrestling wouldn't work and just sort of holding Yan against the fence for a lot of it. Yan probably still got more actual things done in the clinch. It's just that Aljo was really committed to, keep pouring volume on Yan, forcing him back to the fence where he wouldn't get, where Yan was, he was fine with dropping those first 2 rounds. He'd defend, he'd walk back to the fence, he'd defend the takedown, and Aljo would be worse for wear doing all of it because Yan wouldn't have taken really anything substantial. And B, Aljo, he was doing all of it so inefficiently that he didn't really have a hope of keeping that up over 5 rounds. So with all that, how do I think the second fight will go? I think Yan probably picks it up pretty quickly this time. Not picks it up as in wins pretty quickly, but I think he gets Aljo his rhythm pretty quickly. Aljo's really options. He has one option in this fight, which is after the first fight, he's going to feel the need to slow it down a little bit because of how badly he gassed in the first fight. And I think that's the wrong move. Aljo's win condition pretty much always leaned into volatility in terms of like Petr Yan, he always looked like a hard man to wrestle. Some people pointed to the Jin Soo-san fight where he got taken down, but like otherwise, it's really, really difficult to see an example of someone who, even if you don't see their takedown defense live, you can tell that Yan is, A, he's super strong, B, he is really, really urgent in the clinch, and C, he has the right tactics in the clinch to make wrestling really, really difficult. And I think a lot of us predicted that going into Aljo, which means that if Aljo won, it would probably be, someone slips, Yan makes a mistake, Aljo ends up on his back and squishes him, rather than some sort of concerted whole fight gambit. And Yan beating Aljo after Aljo leaned into that might convince Aljo that he needs to try to come up with a whole fight gambit. And I think he's mechanically, tactically, strategically kind of behind Yan in every phase. Not really being able to rule the clinch or sit on top of Yan makes the cardio a lot bigger of an issue for Aljamain Sterling because he's going to be fighting at distance. He's not going to get any sort of breaks. And Yan is just a much tighter, more economical puncher. Yan showed against Corey Sandhagen a whole lot of tools to deal with that sort of volume. Even if Aljo were like really, really consistent and were able to keep that up for 5 rounds, Corey Sandhagen, he does that game a lot better. Like Aljamain Sterling's a better fighter than Corey Sandhagen. We've seen that, but he's a better fighter in a phase that Yan already hasn't allowed. And if he decides that that's not the route that he wants to take this, Corey Sandhagen was a lot more equipped to put on a ton of volume on Yan and overwhelm him than Aljamain Sterling is, because both guys are clever offensively, but Corey Sandhagen is a lot tighter offensively. He's got a better process for it. And Petr Yan, he didn't like shut him out, but he did a very good job, dealing with, for instance, Corey Sandhagen kept trying to like step in and angle off, and Yan would just pivot with him and crack him. Lots of really, really good counter punching and counter striking in general, where like Corey Sandhagen would try to enter, feint in, and exit. And by the time he could feint, Yan was already like kicking him on the exit or countering in combination, shifting him back. And I could see shifting being a problem with Aljamain Sterling with the wrestling strat, but also there's the consideration of Aljamain Sterling's shots in open space never really looking all that great. That was something that Ed Gallo pointed out before the Munoz fight, I think even after the Munoz fight, is that Aljamain Sterling is at his best as like a sort of a clinchy fence wrestler type, and that's really the situation you don't want to be in with Petr Yan. So tough to give Aljo much of a shot here, I think. If Aljo comes in, does the thing that he did the first time, I think he'll have a worse performance than he did the first time. But I think it'll be better than the performance he'll have if he decides that he's going to let Yan, strike at distance and make his reads even quicker. Because really the route to beating Petr Yan, I don't think it's all that clear, but Aljamain Sterling gave as good a crack at it as anybody. Jimmy Rivera, I guess maybe, but Rivera still lost those first 2 rounds because Petr Yan, if you give him the room to pressure and you give him the room to shift in and the room to probe, it's going to be very difficult to take a clear round off him. But Aljamain Sterling, he took, a bunch of clear minutes off Petr Yan just by keeping the volume up, keeping it really, really diverse, forcing Yan to get into a shell and defend everything. And yes, it was part of Yan's plan, but it's also not really prudent to take credit away from Aljo for doing that well, because Yan was there on the counter in the first round, as we saw, and Aljo just made it difficult. So if Aljo keeps going with that, I think he has a shot of making it interesting. But really, any sort of interest that Aljo has in this fight, it's not going to last past a round or 2. And yeah, I don't think you're going to finish Yan in a round or 2. So tons of respect to Aljamain Sterling. He's a very good fighter. Number 2 bantamweight in the world for now. I think Dillashaw and Aldo are probably tough for him, but I think he probably beats obviously Sanhagen, probably Rob Font, who I rate super highly. He's a tough fight for a lot of guys, and I unfortunately just don't think Petr Yan is one of them. So yeah, that's that fight. Now we're on to the third fight from the top, which is Khamzat Chimaev versus Gilbert Burns. Now, it's tough to say a whole lot of things about Khamzat Chimaev that are particularly established. We know that he is a crazy athlete, crazy strong, crazy fast. I don't really know about his conditioning yet. I don't think anyone does. But as of now, the stuff that he's show that he's a crazy athlete. So that's cool. Super strong process on top. That has the sort of general Russian grappling meta, which is lots of wrist traps, wrestling rides, tremendous top game, good against the fence, great ground and pound, consistent with that, has a good sub game from the back. But it's tough to say a whole lot because I think Chimaev, he's had maybe the softest run to a top 3 fight that anyone in recent history has. I mean, yeah, you could point to guys like, I don't know, Michael Chandler or someone who came in and got one fight with Dan Hooker and immediately got to it. But like Dan Hooker's a good fighter. And more to the point, I think a lot of people expected Dan Hooker to be tricky for Michael Chandler. Dan Hooker was A, off that Poirier fight, and B, it was a tall, kicky knee guy against a guy who liked the level change and doesn't like kicks, for instance. Like, this is a good example because, like, you could point to him being better treated, I suppose, but A, he was a more established name, and B, he fought someone who had a real chance of beating him. Chimaev, he hasn't really dealt with either. First fight in the UFC, John Phillips, who, that was short notice, but also, like, beating John Phillips is, there's no way to do it impressively enough. There's simply no way. They call him the white Mike Tyson because he has the same amount of ground game. And afterwards, it was Reese McKee, who I don't know how good of a fighter he is. He does have a win over Jai Herbert, who's like okay, so I'm not gonna like talk too much shit about him, I guess. But he was a lightweight. He came in on short notice, because Chimaev needed a fight 10 days after the Phillips fight. So it's hard to take a ton from that either, especially when you're a really big welterweight who likes control wrestling against a very small non-welterweight who, I don't know whether he's been vulnerable to that in the past, but you don't really need to be in that sort of situation. Afterwards, Gerald Meerschaert, who I really like Gerald Meerschaert, but it's more despite his flaws than, because he doesn't have them. I did not pick him over Khamzat Chimaev, and I think there's a lot to be said about Chimaev's win over Meerschaert being impressive, but he also didn't really contend with the thing that makes Meerschaert a compelling opponent to start with. Meerschaert's thing is grappling. And he's not, even in the grappling, I expected Chimaev to win that. So I'm not saying that, he would have won if he didn't get knocked out in 10 seconds because, we saw the Hermanson fight where Meerschaert wanted to grapple and the only way he could initiate that was like lat dropping himself. But knocking him out in 10 seconds, it's a little bit less impressive than actually dealing with what Meerschaert's actually good at. So not a ton of information either way, even if you want to call that a decent win. It's A, not a welterweight win, and B, we didn't really see the depths of Chimaev's skill set there. And finally, Li Jingliang. And I mean, I think Jingliang is a fine fighter in general, but I also kind of liken that to Makhachev versus Dober a lot, where it's decent to beat guys like Dober and Jingliang on the feet. Like, they're not complete pushovers there. But if you're a grappler and you beat them, it's not all that impressive, because both guys are just not optimized to deal with that sort of thing at all. I mean, the thing I said about Leach is that they call him Leach because he sucks when placed on a flat surface. He got wrestled by Neil Magny, got wrestled by Jake Matthews. And neither guy really has a sort of height that Khamzat Chimaev does, for good reason. But, Chimaev, he, both in terms of opponent quality and opponent style, he hasn't really had a real challenge yet. Gilbert Burns, I mean, I guess I should go on record and say Gilbert Burns should be that sort of challenge. The thing that worries me is the size difference. Burns is also a former lightweight. The difference is he moved up to 170 about, I want to say, like 2 or 3 years ago. And he's done a really good job. He's a very good welterweight. He, however, is sort of a wide welterweight. He's not a big welterweight necessarily. We saw against Tyron Woodley, he looked, I wouldn't say like necessarily smaller than Tyron Woodley. I think he looked like a tiny bit bigger, if anything. Woodley is also like not huge framed as a welterweight. Most of his weight is in his gigantic ass. So against a decently sized middleweight in Khamzat Chimaev, who wants to control wrestle, I'm not going to hold out hope that Gilbert Burns is going to win. All that said, I think there is a really good chance that Gilbert Burns can cause some damage here, in that A, Gilbert Burns is a genuinely elite grappler, one of the best in the sport. His wrestling is all right. It's not nearly as good as his grappling, but his grappling is very good. We have seen him get laid on by Michel Prazeres in the past, for instance, but it hasn't happened in a while. And he's a very good wrestler. He hits like a truck. He's got a whole lot of skills. And I think the one thing that really interests me about Gilbert Burns, and I think it's the thing that makes him the best welterweight outside of Kamaru Usman and Leon Edwards, is that he is immensely keen about really maximizing his strengths. And that's the sort of thing that you don't really see at welterweight, where you have guys who are either, not good at certain things, or not smart about certain things, or just not very active. And the thing that Gilbert Burns has gotten up this high in the rankings this relatively quickly, it's because he's active, he's clever, and he's versatile. And those are things that you really don't see. And I think the thing about his cleverness is it especially shows up really early in a fight. And I think that makes the first minute in this fight very interesting, because if Chimaev can manhandle him, we might not see the sort of adjustments that Burns has in the tank. I mean, Burns isn't some sort of unbreakable cardio machine. He has at least one very strong 5-round performance, but it's against a blank slate, really. But we have seen him gas out a bit, especially after blowing his load against Kamaru Usman. But if it doesn't quite go that way, I think there's a good chance Burns has something really specific up his sleeve, the way that he had for instance, Tyron Woodley, right? With Tyron Woodley, it was come in, draw out the right-hand counter, immediately get underneath it, and hit him really hard in the face. And it's a specific tactic that Burns had instantly, like 30 seconds into the fight. Burns was like, I'm going to do this. He went in and he did it, and it worked. With Kamaru Usman, right? He knew that Usman would come out trying to jab, and yeah, there's some weirdness with teammates fighting all the time, but Usman's jab, it was an important tool against Woodley. It was an important tool against guys like Masvidal. It's shown up a lot. It was an important tool against RDA. And Burns was like, I see this jab. I'm going to deal with it as proactively and as quickly as I can, not just to knock him out early, but to make sure he doesn't do this again. So Burns came out, he cross-countered it as soon as he possibly could, came out playing it off the uppercut and the knee to make sure that Usman wouldn't try to change levels off the feints. Like, crazy smart work. And it's something that you don't really see. And against Stephen Thompson, right? That was a very losable fight for Gilbert Burns. As odd as that sounds after Wonder Boy's been sat on by Bilal Muhammad, that was a fight that I think a lot of smart people expected Burns to lose, because Burns is the sort of, as a striker, he's sort of, he's not a really patient pressure. He's a sort of, sort of rush guys when he feels it. He works in these big blitzes a lot of time, like he jabs and he kicks, but when he's doing anything more committed, it's always in like a big sort of flurry. So against someone like Wonder Boy, who's very good at breaking the line of attack, making it really hard to rush him, countering, Burns just didn't fuck with it. He didn't care. He just sort of drew Wonder Boy forward. He took a long shot to a single and just drowned him in the clinch for as long as he could. Like, these are very smart game plans that Burns is doing, and more than just being smart game plans, they're urgent game plans, they're urgent, tactical, specific ways for Burns to deal with these specific fighters. Now, Chimaev, there's a lot less to look at, which is, I think, a problem. And Chimaev's size difference is a problem. The athleticism difference, that's likely, is a problem. But I also think that there's a lot of ways, more than the average fighter, more than the average even, top-ranked welterweight, for Gilbert Burns to come out and exploit something in Chimaev that we haven't seen yet. Like, if he's able to back off Chimaev early with that sort of counter that he landed on Usman or Woodley, for instance, then we might see Burns start to build offense on him. And Burns is someone who's actually very well equipped to do that. So I guess it really depends, because if Chimaev comes out and smokes Gilbert Burns, I think it's impressive. If Chimaev comes out and wins a hard fight against Gilbert Burns, I think it's more impressive, because I want to see Chimaev deal with the things that Gilbert Burns brings. On the Chimaev overall hype train thing, I think I'm generally very slow on hype trains. There are guys I like who are lower ranked, but none of them are trains. And I think a lot of it is because the guys I really look for are the ones who, they aren't the ones who don't struggle, they're the ones who are able to overcome struggle. It's pretty much inevitable for a good fighter who's bound for the top to not run into someone difficult by the time they get there. It's not possible, especially in a division like welterweight, which I don't love welterweight, but there's a lot of guys there at the top who are very, very different. Eventually, you're going to run into someone by the time you get to the belt who's going to be hard for you to just roll over. And I think people kind of overestimate how much rolling over guys at the lower level, it translates into rolling over guys at the elite level. Because I think you can even look at it the other way, right? Like, how many really, really elite guys, and there are a bunch you could point to, who at the lower level just didn't struggle one bit. So if you look at someone like Volkanovski, he had that sort of shaky Elkins fight. Look at Holloway, he had a long career. Early was kind of shaky. You look at, I mean, Usman might be the exception a little bit, but because he only had that regional loss, which doesn't really mean anything. But Usman might be the exception. But you look at, Robert Whittaker, who had a bunch of early losses. Israel Adesanya, who had the tough early Vettori fight. Who else? I mean, Petr Yan had Jimmy Rivera. Petr Yan's super good. Aljamain Sterling, he had a bunch of losses early. He had Rafael Sunsao, Brian Caraway, Marlon Moraes. These are all really, really elite fighters. And basically none of them have come through the lower end of the rankings without struggling at least a bit. And I think, if anything, being able to win those sorts of fights, it's a much better indicator than just rolling through even good opponents, because eventually you're going to run into someone who's difficult. And the best indicator of whether you win that fight when you run into someone difficult is not, I've never faced anyone difficult before. It's, I've met someone difficult before and I've been able to beat them. I mean, you can even look at like the lesser elites. Like, you look at guys like Calvin Kattar or Rob Font, who showed up and they immediately had really hard fights. Like Calvin Kattar, he showed up and beat Andre Fili, but it wasn't a clean win. It was a difficult win. He came in and beat Shane Burgos. It wasn't a clean win. It was a difficult win. But he's a clear top 5 because we've seen that he can deal with difficult matchups. And I don't think we've seen that proven with Khamzat Chimaev yet. It's possible that Khamzat Chimaev is everything he's been billed as. He is the next, I don't even know who this would be. I mean, the next Anderson Silva, maybe. I mean, Silva didn't really do it in a great division, but, the next Anderson Silva, he just comes in, clowns everyone easily. He gets to the belt, he clowns them too. He defends the belt, he clowns them too. That's possible, but it's overwhelmingly unlikely. And especially with someone like Kamaru Usman on top, who is difficult stylistically for a control wrestler, I'd prefer to see Chimaev win something hard before I trust him to win a hard matchup. So that's really my take on the whole Chimaev thing. And I think Gilbert Burns, he may be that hard matchup, but I kind of need to see the size difference before really confidently going for a pick here. I think Burns is a difficult guy to control wrestle as well, but he's also not a huge welterweight, and Chimaev is a huge welterweight. So yeah, I guess that's my read. I'm on the fence. As much as I want to pick against Khamzat Chimaev, I can't quite yet in this matchup just because of the physical difference. But as of now, I think Gilbert Burns has shown more, and I think Gilbert Burns is poised to cause some issues. Now, the next fight I will be talking about is not the fourth from the top, because that is Mackenzie Dern versus Tisha Torres, and I'm pretty sure Thanyu and Dan already went through something about that, so go check that out. I'm not very well poised to talk about it. But the fight after that is Marco Madsen versus Vince Pichel. And really at this point, we're just talking about specific fighters because I don't know a ton about Marco Madsen, but Vince Pichel is, he's interesting. He's funny. I think Dan Albert might have gone over him and why I find him compelling on their podcast. He's this really old lightweight who is, he's really, really janky mechanically. He's really, really janky in terms of like how he moves. He's even janky in terms of the tools that he uses. He just keeps like somehow finding a way to win just by like figuring out his opponent's tools and out janking them and out voluming them somehow. Like, I don't even understand how it happens. It's just fascinating to me to watch. So I don't have a ton to say about Vince Pichel. I just appreciate him. I admire him. He's like 38-ish, something, somewhere around there. And he beat Jim Miller, who is, you shouldn't be beating Jim Miller if you're, the people that beat Jim Miller, they don't tend to be other old veterans. I'll put it that way. Like Clay Guida, he got smoked by Jim Miller. And Clay Guida is historically a fairly durable, fairly good grappler. And Jim Miller just beat him in like 50 seconds. So the people that beat Jim Miller, they tend to athlete him. And Vince Pichel, he's a very good athlete, but he's also an old man type athlete. He's like crazy powerful. He's crazy strong. And not like, he's more strong than he is powerful. I'll put it that way. But Pichel beat him while being that sort of athlete, which is, I think, a little bit surprising. He just beat Austin Hubbard, who is a decent fighter. Hubbard is I think he was a wrestler, but Pichel's big thing, his big issue, like his 2 losses in his career, have been to wrestlers. He got suplexed, of course, by Husam Habilov, and he got dominated by Greg Gillespie. So I think like being a better, more athletic, sort of hustly, grapply type, it's the kind to give him not that many routes. But if you're less experienced, if you're not as clever, I think Vince Pichel is a sort of guy to really give you some trouble. Marco Madsen, I don't think he's a sort of domineering top control guy. He just had a very close fight against Clay Guida, I believe. So something to think about. I think Vince Pichel is, he's a compelling, I don't know whether he's an underdog. I kind of expect him to be a slight one, but he's a compelling fight. So yeah, that's cool. I mean, you know, sort of old vet, and also his facial hair is awesome. As you can tell, I don't really have much to brag about in that respect. So I always admire someone who can really develop and cultivate something that there are no adjectives to describe it. It's indescribable. I'll just leave it at that. It's very good. But yeah, after that, the whole middle part of the card, it's nothing super special. There's Jairzinho Rozenstruik versus Marcin Tybura, which is it's an okay heavyweight fight, which is to say it's a bad fight overall. But, you know, I do know a little bit about Rozenstruik. He's a decent counterpuncher and a decent counter kicker at heavyweight, but he is incredibly low volume, and he's not like awesome enough at either to really decisively win minutes. He doesn't really care about winning minutes, really. Marcin Tybura, he is sort of a pressury, hustly, sort of wrestly type. Rozenstruik is an awful wrestler. We've seen that against like Overeem and, I mean, sort of Blades. Like, he's not terrible on bottom. He's not like embarrassingly bad, but he's not very good at it. And Marcin Tybura might be the guy to take advantage of that. But I also kind of think that Tybura is probably going to hustle his way into a whole bunch of counters. He's not really going to be able to close distance. A lot of this feels like the way people thought about Rozenstruik versus Sakai, where you look at the higher volume guy enforcing volume on a bunch of people and expecting him to do it against like one of the only counter punchers in the division. So who knows? I think it's an even-ish fight, and I think the line is close to evens. But I don't know. I expect Rozenstruik to bonk him really hard several times, and you know, Tybura couldn't wrestle Volkov, and we've just seen how relatively easy Volkov is to grapple. So it's not a good sign. I mean, having a mount of comeback against Greg Hardy is never a good sign. So yeah, I'll go with Rozenstruik there, but you know, not a whole lot to trust on either side. I just felt it was worth a mention. Not nearly as much of a mention, however, as Julio Arce versus Daniel Willie Cat Santos. I don't really know what Willie Cat does. I've heard he trains with Charles Oliveira, which is compelling because you know, Charles Oliveira is he doesn't have a ton of tools that might really behoove you to use against someone who's less athletic in the clinch and all that. But he's a clever fighter. I feel like he's a good person to train with if you're that sort of fighter. I saw his fight where he's spinning heel kick that dude in the body. That was cool. I think I think it was Cleverson Silva, and Cleverson's still kicking around in ACA. So there's something. But Yeah, I don't really know that much about Daniel Willycat Santos, but I hope he's competitive because it means one more really good fighter. Because to be competitive with Julio Arce, I think Arce is one of the most underrated fighters in the sport. Tiger Schulman, southpaw boxer, really clever, strong jab, southpaw jabber. I think, like, honestly, if you made me choose between him and Arnold Allen a while ago, I would have chosen Arce as the better southpaw jabber when both of them were at featherweight. Because Arce, he is really, really good at drawing counters with the southpaw jab and also defending proactively off that southpaw jab, where he's constantly, taking little side steps or dipping or pivoting off the jab. And he's really, really difficult to counter. He's also really good at building off those little footwork tricks. Or for instance, Dan Ige ran into this over and over, right? He'd bite on the jab, he'd keep trying to rush linearly at Arce, and Arce would already be like at an angle, smacking him up. And Ige, he's not a bad win. Like, as I said before, he improved a lot by the time he hit, Calvin Kattar, Korean Zombie, and Josh Emmett, but it was not a bad win by the time Julio Arce got him. And he still looks like the sort of fighter that would struggle pretty mightily with Julio Arce. So that's a cool win. But yeah, even in the fights that Arce's lost, because Arce's thing of being kind of a speedster, pocket jabby boxer type, guys like Sriram Muralidaran and Hakeem Dawodu, who would try to take the pocket away with their kicks and with the clinch, they're pretty inherently difficult style matchups for him. But Arce looked good in both of those fights. Shaman nearly killed him like 3 times in the first 2 rounds, but Arce came back and won the 3rd round pretty clearly, which, I mean, I guess Shaman Moraes is pretty much expected, but still looked like a fight he'd win over 5 rounds. Hakeem Dawodu, honestly, kind of the same thing. Arce, he was able to get off a lot of his pocket game even in that fight, even though he sort of seemed to get kind of a dead leg early in the fight with one of those leg kicks. So both of those are difficult fights for Julio Arce, and I think making it through, making it relatively close by the end, it's a real credit to him. The fight that he had last time, it wasn't close. It was a knockout loss to Song Yadong, but Yadong did a really good job in that fight, actually. He was super clever. He did, when Arce started jabbing and defending proactively, Yadong started aiming counters to the body, taking that away, and he obviously kicked Arce in the head soon after, playing the right kick off the right hand. So Yadong, we've seen since, he has some real elite upside. I mean, beating Moraes isn't as impressive as beating Arce at this point, but he is the sort of prospect to keep an eye on. He has some real elite upside, and I think Julio Arce is the sort of fighter who, beating him, it really means something. Song Yadong beating Julio Arce, it convinces me more on Yadong than any other win that he's gotten yet, at least. So yeah, I don't really know enough about Willycat to really make a pick. I guess it's going to be Arce on presumption, but that is a very cool fight. And I think Arce, even if it's not competitive, Arce always has very fun fights, even if they're dominant, right? We've seen him box up guys like Andre Ewell, who's pretty solid as a striker, Dan Ige, as I mentioned, Daniel Tamer, who's not very good, but that fight was still worth watching. Julian Erosa was actually a really fun fight because Erosa kept pressuring to the fence, and Arce didn't seem to like really care about getting off the fence, but Arce just kept like defending against the cage and boxing him up when he was there, and eventually knocked him out with a head kick. So yeah, a couple cool fighters on this card. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, go check out the more structured, better content from better minds that we've done on this. I believe Forbidden Technique is going to be out, and Fanyo and Dan's work. I'll go watch the videos that we've done on all these guys. Lots of cool stuff. Like, we're big fans of Volkanovski and Yan. I think we wrote an article on Gilbert Burns after the Woodley fight, so go read that too. That was actually pretty cool. Me and Ryan co-wrote it. I think Ben was on there too, so that was cool. Visit the website. I know we don't say that enough. There's not a whole lot of updates to it, but the stuff that's there is still there, and I think it's pretty good. So I'm going to try to get on it a little bit more once I get some time, which with full-time work, I can guarantee you it will be there. If you believe that, I'm sorry. But yeah, I'll give it a good go to try to get some more content on there. So yeah, thank you for joining me. I'm Sriram, and yeah, later.